Larry, my friend, good afternoon. How are you?
Great, Shad. It is nice to be back in this studio as always with
Yes,
you.
sir. Absolutely. I
How are
enjoy the
you
time that
doing?
we get to spend. I'm doing good, doing good.
Good.
So I think we talked a little bit about, we wanted to talk a little about this idea or concept of servant leadership, which I think you, over the last couple of years, that and emotional intelligence, which is probably another episode, we hear a lot of that as kind of a cliche word. So I thought you could enlighten us a little bit on what is servant leadership and a little bit of its background.
Yeah, that's good. And it is an important topic. I will tell you, you hear more and more about servant leadership as a style. I will also tell you that I've heard it used in a way that I don't think servant leadership is really intended to serve, no pun intended, as a style. So let's just talk a little bit about, I think if we could break this down for our audience into backdrop, right, as you
Hmm.
mentioned, and talk a little bit about the origin and the definition, and then talk about some insights that people could use and take away from the
Yeah.
conversation, right?
So
So I think first it's helpful to understand that, this hasn't been around forever, even though 50 some years might seem like a long time. It was coined by a gentleman by the name of Robert Greenleaf, and it was actually published in an essay in 1970. That
mm,
was really the origin of the term servant leadership. I'll go as far as academia in this one dimension of the conversation, that as a leadership style, it really emanated from another style called transformational leadership, which is the opposite of transactional. I give you a paycheck, you do
yeah,
this work.
yeah,
Transformational is more about inspiring people through a vision, but transformational leadership is more about let me inspire you so we can achieve these objectives. Now, here's the difference. Servant leadership is about let me inspire you and let me help develop you and build trust, but it's not with any objective in mind. It's not about me inspiring you around organizational objectives. It's
mm,
really very pure, which is why I will tell you the model applied in pure terms isn't necessarily realistic like any other model, right? It's about behaviors that will help you be more servant leader like than being a servant leader in its most pure form, which is not necessarily realistic, which
realistic.
is why, yeah, there's been a lot of conversations and even research and papers written about, how effective is it or isn't. I think you could say that about any style. It's more about how do you take certain elements of a style and weave it into your own tapestry of what good leadership looks like
Yeah.
and is effective for you. So that's kind of the backdrop of servant leadership in terms of where it emanated and what it's really all about. So taking it a step further, though, in terms of the focus, when leaders are trying to build more servant-like behavior around their style, it has to do with this idea of vision always comes into play, like with any other style. So being
Hmm.
really good at communicating and setting the vision, it also again has a lot to do with encouraging ownership. So whereas so many other styles of leadership, at least some of the more traditional styles, were about the leader being at the front of the pack
Yeah.
and others and having followership. This is as much to do about encouraging and sharing leadership and position power.
Well, it's
It's
empowering that leadership in those other people, right? To the best of their ability,
exactly,
right?
exactly, and that has a lot to do with the trust building element, the very pure trust building element of servant leadership, where it really, and that's why I think trust becomes such a big part
Yeah.
of this
Hmm.
particular style, because it's kind of like a no strings attached style,
Yeah.
right? Which is why, again, modulating that to some degree in reality in terms of how it really works in real time is an
Yeah.
important consideration. And then I think the other part, and this has to, we just talked about this, is this idea that it has a lot to do with the individual who's trying to be more servant like is providing these frameworks where people are being set up to flourish, right? And so, again, it has a lot to do with pouring energy into others to develop them and help
Yes.
them develop themselves.
But I
So
think
that's the
to
key.
to clarify and to kind of go back on that, because I think that makes a ton of sense, and I agree with that definition. where I think people, and I think you touched on this and want to maybe elaborate on this, where I think people get confused is I'm going to empower you to be the best, direct report or best clinician or whatever that you are, operator that you can be, so that we can achieve our organizational objective. That's transformational leadership. If I'm going to coach you and empower you and trust in you to become the best individual that you can be, that's servant leadership.
It's a great summary.
Right.
And I think that really
We
nails
get
it.
caught up on the objective, but if you hire the right people or have the right people in place to meet the objective, you don't have to worry about the objective. You just paint the picture. And then what do you need to do? And what do you need from me to get to be the best person you can be?
Yeah, that's a great summary. I think that's bullseye.
Yeah.
Really on point. So there are some characteristics, right? And they kind of bleed into some of the areas we just talked about and some of the focal points, but it's really important that servant leaders, and you see it a lot in people who are more servant-like in terms of characteristics, high levels of integrity, this idea of putting others first. And again, that's at the core of the framework itself. And as a result of that, because as we mentioned a second ago, vision is always very foundational to any style of leadership, being a good communicator, but that idea of not just talking, but listening.
Yes.
Really, really important. So effective listening becomes really core to this particular style, especially if how we're going to develop trust if I'm not listening to you in this one way. So that's a big part of this. And this idea of really strong collaboration, as we talk about what's in some of the other styles as well, strong collaboration is huge. So, and then last, and you see this a lot in literature about servant leadership, it has a lot to do with, the moral authority and this idea of, establishing trust and confidence within the people that you're leading and collaborating with.
Sure.
So those are consider those some of what I'll call like core characteristics. And then I think the big, the bottom line is in terms of putting this into practice, and this is going to, it's very similar to what we just talked about. It's really important to model the way. And we've talked about this in everything we've been talking about in this Lean In Leaders podcast, in every version, modeling authenticity, modeling humility, and building and modeling trustworthy relationships is really important. Another consideration as you try to develop more servant leader-like behavior is really talking and explaining and demonstrating why the work is important. So maybe not telling people, as much, when we think of like telling versus asking or engaging and inspiring people, but it's still important that part of the communication that goes along with servant leadership is talking about the why. And that is really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
Building community is really important, and that's where the collaboration comes in. And then I think, again, as we talked about throughout the brief conversation, this idea that really supporting the team in a growth and development oriented way is so central to this particular style.
It's
and that's
the core of
really
servant
important.
leadership, right? That you exist as the leader to make those around you better.
Exactly.
And to do that, you have to know who they are, what they value, why that's important to them. That whole thing that we talk about, authenticity and integrity. And I think you touched on it, and you can't harp on it too much. With servant leadership, active listening and not having the answers, but empowering those that work with and for you to come up with the answers are absolutely critical. But there's also that piece there, and you can talk about this a little bit too, I think. There's this piece on where I think people think, well, I'm a servant leader, therefore I'm just going to hand over all the power to the team. That's when I'll just let them run the show. But there's an accountability and a vision that we have to work towards. It's not about I just absolve myself of responsibility because I'm a servant leader and I provide lunch. Do you know what I mean? That's not what it is.
Well, that is where I think a lot of people get confused when they don't understand either both the academic and practical concept of what servant leadership is. It sounds like you're just abdicating everything.
Yes.
And that's not
what it
about.
is.
It's about the relationships that you're developing people and the pureness of it,
Yeah.
but it certainly is not the complete degradation or erosion of
Yeah.
organizational structures that need to exist in almost every organization, unless you're operating in what they call teal organizations, which we may talk about in the future. But the idea that you're abdicating everything, including accountability and responsibility, is not the purpose.
Yes.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's in the beginning of our conversation. That's why I pointed that out in a different, said it a different way. But it's really important that people don't think you are serving people in a different way, but it's through relationship, it's through collaboration, it's through a very pure form of development and growth. But it does not mean that I don't have responsibility now as a leader.
Yes.
So, and that's why it's a really good way to outro, because I wanted to triple click on that point that there are pros and cons to this leadership style, which is why adopting any one style in a pure sense is not only not realistic, it's probably not a healthy way
it's impractical.
of building, right. And the idea is to build your own, again, I'll call it your own leadership tapestry, and taking different and focusing more on behaviors versus a style. And actually, I will be sharing some content about that in an upcoming content share. I think that's really important that people think about that. How do we become more servant leader like? What behaviors do I need to adopt? Muscle tissue do I need to build to be more of a servant leader, and to be at the end of the day, a more effective leader for myself and others.
Yeah. That's terrific. The way I look at servant leadership, and I work with it in coaching practice, is servant leadership is about serving the people that work for you. Right? It's simple.
Absolutely.
And if you invest yourself in that, if that's where you see your responsibility, then you do what's right for your people, you do what's right for the organization, you get that balance. So I think if you could walk away from this with one thing as a leader, what would be the one tip you would give somebody to start practicing servant leadership more effectively today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll put myself in that scenario.
Yeah.
And I think that when I think about execution and I think about achieving my objectives and the organization's objectives, try to pump the brakes whenever possible and lead out with a more authentic, more no strings attached approach, and see what happens. Okay. How do I just connect to people more authentically and try to put the agenda in the backdrop, not the forefront?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. I think for me, if I took that same question for myself, when I'm thinking about trying to be a servant leadership in my executive roles, it has been, and I think it's very similar to what you're saying. I understand as a central leader, an executive leader within an organization, why the organization needs to accomplish a certain objective, right? And so, but I'm not going to explain that to the people that work on my team, but rather helping explain why that's important to an organization for them, so they understand how we can serve more people. And then turning that back around to them and say, then how do you contribute to that? What do you bring to the table that's really good? That can make that difference. And then how do I help you unlock that so you can be the best at that?
Right on. You actually just took the kind of the in practice part of the discussion that we outroed with a minute ago, and you wove it all together.
Yeah,
it really is. That's that bottom up empowerment we talked about, where in that, and you know, when I just listened to you, Shad, the word that literally like popped into my mind with like imaginary light bulbs was intentionality.
Yeah.
And we didn't use that word yet, but I think it has a lot to do with like your intentions and how you approach people and the relationships in the workplace.
That's huge. Yeah, especially in that servant leadership model, in any model, any effective model, being intentional and being people focused. So,
and as you said, just being a more effective leader, style aside, how do I just become a more effective leader? And I'll take it one layer deeper. How do I become a more effective human?
That's even better, right? Because if you start there, you'll be a more effective leader. That's a great topic. And I think that's something we've probably talked more about. You know, I think you and I have talked about it in just kind of side side conversations. This is a leadership podcast, but really at the core of this is people podcast.
I love it.
How do we become better people? How do we lean in people? Lean in leaders is more catchy,
There
so
you go.
we use that. But how do we lean in to become better people? And then that translates itself to being better leaders.
Yeah, if you're an authentic leader, if you think about it from that perspective, and you're not showing up as a human every day the way you want to, you're not going to be an effective leader in any degree of authenticity. Right. So that's why we talk about this all the time, like this, so many books written about this and so many different articles. Like, it's that inside out approach, which is part of what we talk about.
Exactly.
In Lean In Leaders, evolving from the inside out. That is it.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Cool. Well, I hope that this has been beneficial. I would encourage you, if you like what you hear, subscribe, like, share, whatever that looks like. And then I would encourage you all, if you're listening, reach out to us and leave a comment. If there's something you want to know more about, let us know so we can share and we can kind of talk about that. We would love to get more interaction and feedback on what's working well for you and what isn't, and how do we help you with that, because that's our goal here at Lean In Leaders. So with that, any final parting words, Larry?
Yeah, just building what you just said, I mean, we're expanding our listening channels, right? So besides our Lean In Leaders podcast content that you'll find on our LinkedIn page, we do have a Lean In Leaders YouTube channel, and we have a podcast channel on Spotify, and soon to be other channels as well, maybe. But for now, just, again, check them all out, listen in any way that you find helpful. But we, appreciate any feedback and likes and reposts that you can give us.
Exactly right.
So thank you. Shad, I appreciate you, man.
Same here, my friend. It's always a pleasure to be doing this with you. And for those of you out here, that if you made it to this point, I encourage you to keep doing the work and to lean in, leaders.